Ka pai. Well, nau mai haere mai kia koutou to this webinar on our recently released emissions reduction monitoring report. This is the Commission's second monitoring report on emissions reductions, and it looks at how well current emissions reductions policies and plans set the country up to meet its climate goals. Ka pai. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our General Manager of Delivery, Robin Campbell, to give an overview of the Commission's role and work program. Over to you, Robin.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Mariana. It's great to be here today. So my name is Robin Campbell. I'm one of the General Managers at He Pouarangi Climate Change Commission. The Climate Change Commission's role is to provide independent expert advice and assessment so that the government can make well-informed decisions. We look at what's needed, what's happening, and what's possible. The system is set out in the Climate Change Response Act. It's designed to provide predictability and stability for government, businesses and communities so everyone can act to reduce emissions with confidence. 5-year emissions budgets act as stepping stones to the long-term 2050 target, and the government's emissions reduction plans set out how they intend to achieve each emissions budget. The Commission advises on the 2050 target, on emissions budgets and plans, and we monitor the country's progress on reducing emissions. The Minister for Climate Change must respond to these reports with an outline of how the government intends to address our recommendations. Our monitoring report sits as part of a broader work program this year. Earlier in 2026, we advised on what the unit limits and price controls should be for the emissions trading scheme over the next 5 years. We do that every year. As part of that piece of work, we also take a broader and longer view on the risks and opportunities facing the ETS and how they can be addressed. Early next year, we will update our advice on the fourth emissions budget for the period 2036 to 2040, what the country's goal for reducing emissions should be in that period. We're required to do that following the government's decision to change the methane target. This work helps define what's possible as the country looks to reduce its emissions into the future. In June and July, we've invited input into how we update this analysis, and we've heard about changes in several areas since 2024 that could affect how much emissions reduction is possible and the impacts that could have. Now we're digging deeper into some of those things, and we'll use what we find as inputs to update our emissions scenarios, which will inform our advice on the fourth emissions budget level that is feasible and ambitious. Our work on reducing emissions goes alongside work on how the country needs to adapt to the changing climate. In a few weeks' time, we will be releasing a progress assessment of the government's National Adaptation Plan. This monitors the implementation and effectiveness of the government's adaptation actions and provides advice for the next plan. That follows our National Climate Change Risk Assessment earlier this year. The risk assessment identified the most significant risks to Aotearoa New Zealand's economy, society, environment, and ecology. It found that climate change is increasingly affecting the core systems in Aotearoa New Zealand, the essentials that keep daily life running, the well-being of communities, the natural environment that supports life and livelihoods, and the way the country plans, decides, and acts together. The Climate Change Response Act requires each emissions monitoring report to include measured emissions and removals from the New Zealand Greenhouse Gas Inventory, the latest projections for current and future emissions and removals, and an assessment of the adequacy of the emissions reduction plan and progress in its implementation, including any new opportunities to reduce emissions. These monitoring reports play an important role in the system designed to help reduce emissions. Monitoring encourages action. Our approach is similar to how a business manages their finances. The country has set an emissions budget for reducing climate pollution, and we assess how we are tracking against meeting that budget. The Commission's reports provide information to support the government to course correct, so it can ensure that budgets are met. By checking progress each year, we build up a clear view of how the country is doing on climate change. Its purpose is to provide information that supports the government of the day to continually improve its plans for climate action to keep the country on track. And by providing public information, these reports can help increase trust in the system. Independent monitoring gives people clear, trusted information, which they can use when interacting with decision makers. That helps build trust in the system. This year's emissions monitoring report arrives in a particular set of context. The assessment is at 1 April. That's when we drew a line in terms of taking a snapshot of progress. Issues will continue to change as we go through the year, and we've sought to recognise events that have happened after the 1st of April where we could, even if they were too late to factor into our formal analysis. It's important to see this year's monitoring report in its broader context as well. Climate risks are more visible, immediate, and expensive. The costs are becoming more real for households in terms of infrastructure, food systems, insurance, and communities. In short, the cost of climate change is growing. There is uncertainty in geopolitics and also an increase in mis and disinformation globally. Internationally, climate action is shifting and realigning. There is growing pressure through supply chains, and the markets that Aotearoa New Zealand exports to continue to demand action. Economic pressures are shaping the context for climate action. Government and household decisions are increasingly being driven by economic resilience priorities. In that context, low emissions technology is increasingly available and affordable, particularly solar, heat pumps, electric vehicles. Battery prices have dropped 75% since 2015. 1 in 4 new cars sold globally is electric, and solar overtook coal for electricity generation in the US earlier this year and provided almost a quarter of EU generation at some times. Aotearoa has experienced global disruption to fossil fuel supply chains and falling domestic gas supply. These mean that cost of living and cost of business pressures keep building as geopolitical issues continue to disrupt fuel and fertilizer supply. Energy prices are very much front of mind. So with that, we turn to what we have found in this year's emissions monitoring report. Our key findings are set out on this slide. Overall, we have found that the risks to meeting emissions budgets are growing. Progress reducing emissions is fragile and it is easily stalled. And while emissions are falling, the pace needs to more than double if we are to stay on track to meet our goals. The government has low-cost options to reduce the barriers that are preventing businesses and households from choosing low emissions technologies. And acting earlier is in the country's best interests. Some types of action do have upfront costs, but they will reduce costs over time and overall, and they will make the transition smoother. On the other hand, delaying action shifts costs onto households and businesses and constrains the country's future options. I now hand over to Rob, who is the project director for this piece of work, to talk through the findings in more detail before we come back and are available to answer your questions at the end.
Thank you, Robin. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Rob Carr. I'm a project director at the Commission. I've been leading the emissions reduction monitoring report in the last year. I'm here to talk to you a little bit more about the detail of what we've found, starting with progress. When we looked at the country's progress over the last few years, we've seen that the country's gross emissions have been falling fairly steadily since 2019 by about 2% a year. When we looked at the latest emission reductions in 2024 in the inventory, we saw that emissions stalled, with a change close to zero. This was largely due to a dry year, which meant that coal was used to generate electricity. Emissions estimates for 2025 suggest that this was temporary and emissions began falling again, but it highlights the need for greater buffers against external factors when we're looking at our emissions. The data for recent years also shows that recent industrial emission reductions have come largely from a drop in production rather than changes in efficiency, technology or fuel switching that we'd want to see for sustained emission reductions that are going to benefit the economy. Forestry continues to play a role. While gross emissions didn't change in 2024, net emissions continue to fall due to increased removals from forests sucking carbon out the atmosphere, and that came from trees that have been planted in previous years. That pace of gradual emission reductions that we've been going through has been a positive, but it isn't fast enough to meet future budgets. We need to more than double the rate that we're reducing emissions in order to make sure that we reach our future emissions goals. And while that's more than feasible, it requires action in the next 1 to 2 years to secure those reductions. Next slide, please. The government has taken or signalled some actions to reduce emissions in the last 12 months. However, these are likely to have been outweighed by other actions that may increase emissions. The most significant policy changes to emission reductions are noted on the slide here, and we track the policy at a more detailed level in each of the report's chapters for the relevant areas. In addition to the climate impacts set out here, the ministry merger, the Māori Climate Platform's funding cycle ending, and the merger of the Crown Research Institutes in the last year may also have implications for Crown treaty responsibilities, iwi Māori relationships, and the use of Mātauranga Māori decision-making, which also needs to be considered. Policy has continued to shift since our analysis cut-off of 1st of April 2026. We've noted the more significant changes in the report that we could at the time as we were working through it, but they don't feed into the risk assessment that we've set for that time period. That'll be a matter for next year's assessment to ensure we're always providing a balanced point-in-time assessment. So turning to those risks, our assessment of risk has increased overall in the last year. Risks have especially increased for agriculture, electricity generation and transport. The New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme is also not efficiently driving emission reductions currently. Projections show that the 2030 biogenic methane target will not be met. The latest government projections showed a 7.9% reduction in biogenic methane by 2030 versus a government target of 10%. The gap in the emissions reduction plan for the third budget has also not been significantly addressed since our last report, and the risks to planned reductions for that period have increased. The second emissions budget is now at significant risk, and current plans are insufficient to meet the third emissions budget. It is also now too late to plant additional forests to address any shortfall in that second emissions budget. Those risks must now be addressed through action to reduce gross emissions. There are sufficient opportunities for the government to ensure budgets are met, and the main areas of risk are also generally the largest areas of opportunity. In many cases, the opportunities that we have to reduce emissions make people and businesses better off. Some of the key examples of that are shown on the slide here, where it is often in people's best economic interest to take up these solutions. Acting earlier to reduce emissions can strengthen resilience, reduce our exposure to shocks, and lower costs for households, businesses, and the country more generally. However, barriers are holding people back from doing this. In particular, upfront cost is a frequent barrier we come across in our analysis. There are a number of options the government has to address those barriers through policy, and those can often come at little or no financial cost to the government, while failing to address them can cost the government and the economy in other ways. Some of the actions will require upfront investment from people, but acting sooner will reduce costs overall and make the transition to a low emissions economy smoother. We've taken a closer look at two examples in this year's report to better understand the business case for them. For businesses who use fossil fuels for heating, electric heat pumps are now generally cheaper than fossil fuel for low temperature heat below 100 degrees. Heat pumps have significantly lower operational costs, on average 39% cheaper for coal and 54% cheaper for gas. This means it's now often cheaper to switch to a heat pump even if your boiler isn't end of life yet. The capital costs will be outweighed by the running cost savings. Another option, renewable biomass, can also be cheaper than coal or gas across the temperature range, including for those higher heat scenarios, particularly if you've got access to hog fuel or wood chips available locally that come at a lower cost than wood pellets. Emissions in 2035 could be up to 3 megatons lower from faster decarbonisation of non-transport energy if we took up more of these opportunities. In transport, while switching to public or active transport will often be the cheapest option for people to reduce their emissions, that's not always a practical option for them. Electric vehicles as a solution are becoming increasingly price competitive with similar internal combustion engine vehicles, and we're seeing that across all vehicle classes, including vans and utes. While they may cost more upfront, they more than pay for themselves in lower fuel and maintenance costs, and in some cases that can be as quick as 5 years that they're paying themselves off. For compact SUVs, which is one of the most common family vehicle classes used in New Zealand, an electric vehicle owner could save around $7,500 on average over 5 years in running costs. Greater adoption of electric vehicles could make emissions up to 3.1 megatons lower in 2035 than currently projected. Ultimately, taking up those opportunities to reduce emissions and the risks to our emissions budgets will require greater action from government. The time to course correct is now short. Many emission reductions depend on decisions made well before those reductions can be realised, and some options for the second emissions budget are already no longer available. This increases the importance of taking action now in areas where barriers, delays, or weak incentives are holding back progress. We recommend the government takes action within the next year to ensure that it can meet its emissions goals. We've sought to highlight the key actions the government can take that would make the biggest difference to reduce emissions and the risks the country faces through our recommendation. These are to start a process for determining how we're going to incentivise further emission reductions and removals in the 2030s, given that the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme in its current form will struggle to do this. For the primary sector, to immediately scale up support measures to ensure we can meet that 2030 biogenic methane target, and reduce barriers for high-value, low-emissions agricultural products to make sure we can secure long-term emission reductions and resilience for our economy. To expand resource recovery facilities, services and planning, and to extend landfill gas capture requirements to Class 2 landfills. For transport, to encourage electric vehicle uptake through strong supply and demand side measures, and support greater shifts to public and active transport, and in the energy space to address those upfront cost barriers to fuel switches for both households and businesses. In some areas around agricultural technology, forestry on Crown land and landfill gas capture, the assumptions underlying the projections in the latest government modelling last year do not appear to be driven by a realistic assessment of current policy. We've recommended the government update its approach in these areas to ensure that projections remain robust. This is important to ensure that both the Commission and the government are able to accurately monitor if the country is on track to meet emissions budgets and to ensure the stability of the emissions trading scheme, as we also rely on those projections to set the emissions cap for that. Now that our report is finished, the next step falls to the government. The government have 3 months to respond to the Commission to outline what they will do to address the risks that we've identified. The policy choices sit with them. This is their opportunity to course correct to ensure that budgets are met. You can find out more about our findings and how they relate to you on our website. We have short summaries available for you where you can get a quick overview of the areas most important to you or the findings overall. The main report where you can read through to find all of our findings, particularly in Chapter 2 where we set out the summary of the findings overall. And a technical annex and supporting spreadsheets are available for those who want to get more into the details and the numbers that sit behind some of the analysis in this year's report. And with that, I'll hand over and we're very happy to take your questions.
Kia ora, Rob. Thank you very much for that. And to you too, Robin. I hope that was helpful for you all. And thank you for those who are already getting their questions in. I just want to remind those of you that, you can pop your questions in the Q&A at any time and we'll get to them. And if there's a question you like, you can upvote and we'll prioritise those questions. With that said, Kath, you got in first, but Ben Coventry's, he's had his question upvoted, so I'll go to that first. May I ask what the time frame for the presented MPV benefits and EV costs and boilers costs? It may have been there, but I missed it. I'll hand that to you, Rob, to answer.
Yes, so for the electric vehicle costs, the net present value set out there was over 5 years, and for boilers, I believe it was over the lifetime of them.
Ka pai. Thank you for that. Short and sweet. Appreciate it. Kath, we'll go to your question now. Have you or will you estimate the effect that would result for emissions if the Conservation Amendment Bill allows economic activity on all public conservation land? Robin, I'll pass that to you.
Thanks for the question, Kath. We haven't in this year's report. One reason for that is that that bill was introduced after the 1 April cut-off date for our analysis. It's the kind of thing we could look at in next year's report. We would the scope of different possibilities for what opening up economic activity on public conservation land is very broad. So we would need to look into what the likely implications of that would be over different time periods, whether it's a lot of economic activity of a high emissions variety versus a small amount, or there's a lot of different variables we would look into if we were looking at that.
Tēnā koe, Robin. I hope that was helpful for you there, Kath. I'm moving now to a question from Georgia Miskell. Can you please explain the reasons why electricity generation risk has increased? Rob, could you pick that question up for us? Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your question, Georgia. There's a few different factors that have led into that increase in electricity generation risk. Part of it is due to what's changing in our gas market. So gas supplies have been dropping, and when that happens, it means that coal might be needed to generate electricity in the system when we have dry years or peaks in demand. And so that has increased some of the risks in the electricity generation space. One of the other things that we've done in this year's assessment is had a bit more of a look at the detail of what's actually being built in terms of electricity generation and how that's going to meet our future needs. So for the last 2 years in particular, New Zealand has been building record amounts of new electricity generation, and that's a real positive for enabling us to reduce our emissions. However, a lot of what's being built is additional wind and solar that isn't always coming with firming attached to it or storage that enables us to make sure that that electricity is going to be in the system at the right time when we need it. And so we've also factored into our assessment more of a look at this time about whether the types of infrastructure that are going to come on are going to deliver us stable levels of electricity generation that are going to match demand. And we think there's a bit more work that needs to happen in that space. So that has also fed into the assessment there this year.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. And great question, Georgia. Appreciate that. I have a question now from Casey McDonnell. Does the Commission have a view on how long it will take to commercially distribute methane inhibiting technologies? Very important part of our work considering technologies. I'll pass that question over to you, Rob, to pick up.
Thank you, Casey. Great question. There's some complexity here in that we expect to see those technologies come through in the next few years and be commercially available in that time frame. So a bolus that could reduce methane emissions significantly is already going through regulatory approval processes now. But in its initial rollout, it's likely to be quite limited to just some categories of beef cattle for how it's first used. For these technologies to be used in a widespread way, it requires not just for that technology to be available on the shelf for people to buy. It requires farmers to build trust in it, consumers to build trust in it, and that takes time, and it takes time to go through all the regulatory processes that can be involved as well. And to actually get that scale adoption, there needs to be strong financial incentives in place for farmers to adopt that technology. In the last year, the government removed the intention to price agricultural emissions. And since then, they have put in place the AgriZero and NZ Adoption Accelerator program, which will help make a difference to get that early adoption from people for up to sort of the first 15% of use for it. But after that point, we don't see clear mechanisms yet for how we're going to achieve the scale adoption of these technologies. Farmers either need to have a clear financial incentive from price, from some sort of payment that they're getting from customers or the government, or they need to see really clear productivity benefits for them from that technology, which get demonstrated through field trials. And we're not seeing enough yet of those incentives to achieve scale adoption for us to be confident that we can widely adopt these technologies. There needs to be further work there to make sure that we've got the right set of incentives in place for farmers to pick up those technologies. Whilst we're likely to get some early adopters that will pick them up and start to use them, if we want to drive meaningful reductions in methane, there would need to be stronger incentives for farmers in place.
Fantastic. Appreciate that response there, Rob. I hope that was helpful for you. We're getting a few questions, naturally being an election year, in relation to the impact of the election on our work, which I will pass over to Robin in a second to pick up. So one here from Graham Pollard. With the government needing to respond before the general election, is there a risk that their response will be non-committal, awaiting the election outcome? And will the other parties have opportunities to respond as well?
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. The way the system is set up requires the government of the day to respond to the Commission's reports as part of that sort of call and response system between the Commission and the government. How the Commission responds is entirely how the government responds is entirely up to the government of the day, and they will be working through developing their response at this point right now. In terms of other parties, I mean, anyone can comment on the Commission's work, and we welcome people using our work to inform their own thinking and decision making, be it in the public sector, the private sector, the community sector. But no one else has to legally respond to the work in the way that the government has to acknowledge and respond to the Commission's work.
Kia ora, Robin. Another question in relation to the election.
Answer as well.
Yes, you go, Rob.
Environment Select Committee later this week. So that'll be an opportunity for other political parties to understand our findings as well and ask us questions about them. So there'll be the opportunity there for other parties to understand the findings.
Yes, thanks for adding that, Rob. Another question here in relation to the timing of the elections and their effect on our work. So from Katie Glennie, she asks, how will the timing of the next election affect the government's ability to effectively respond to this advice? Robin, I'm going to pass that question over to you.
Yeah, another good question. The election is in November. There is some time for the government to develop its response before then, but ultimately those are really questions for the government. We can't speak for the government on how or when they will respond.
Ka pai. A question now from Karan Titus. Do you factor in health sector savings for, hypothetically, less fossil fuel pollution? It's a tangible benefit to New Zealand's economy, often undercounted. I'll, in the first instance, pass that to you, Rob.
Absolutely, we do look at those opportunities for health savings. Making the switch to electrification can have huge benefits for people's health, and that doesn't just benefit us in terms of their well-being, but also in terms of the improved productivity for New Zealand if we get to take advantage of people not needing those sick days and so on. When we did our analysis last year, we had a specific look at the health impacts of if the government followed a faster path for electrification in transport and the energy sectors. And that found that out to 2035, we could be saving more than $1 billion in health costs by that point by switching to a faster pathway for the decarbonisation of those areas. So there's huge potential health benefits that, one, we're going to achieve from the transition that we're already making, but also still further gains that we can make there from the additional opportunities that are on the table still.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. I'll pass now to a question from Daniel Sloan, who asks, what are the major government-supported opportunities to address the upfront cost barrier for businesses? Rob, I'll want to hand that question over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a range of choices that the government has here, depending on how sort of interventionist it wants to be, and how much it wants to spend. So, the options available go right through from grants to supported loans to things like the rates assistance schemes or to blended finance options together with the financial sector. So there's a real range of potential policy choices that they could use there that would all help address some of those upfront cost barriers. And we've seen the government make some moves in that area with the gas loan transition scheme, which will help remove some of those barriers for users on gas through that in the industrial space through that scheme. We set out a bit more detail on the specific policy opportunities there in chapter 2 of the report, so you can find all the answers there in that chapter.
Fantastic. And yes, as Rob also mentioned earlier, there's lots of fantastic resources that sit alongside the report, and the link that was in the slide, we'll make sure we get that to you in the follow-up email after this webinar. A question now from Te Taru White around the ETS carbon credit, the future of the ETS carbon credits. What does it look like in this space? Our incorporation with a strong forestry base relies on this determination. I'll hand to Rob to pick that one up.
Thank you. Yeah, we've highlighted some concerns around the ETS this year. So there's two sort of different sets of issues going on there. One is in the short term, market confidence in the emissions trading scheme is currently fragile. And so we've seen emission prices fall over the last year because people aren't sure about the future of the market and what's going to change in that space. And then when we look out to the long-term future of the scheme, there's an issue in that the current levels of industrial allocation and how much forestry is likely to come through and what sectors currently included in the schemes mean that it's not actually going to be giving the right balance of supply and demand to meet our emissions budgets once we get past that point. And at the moment, we forecasted that that would happen in about 2034. And in the government's consultation that's just on its latest ETS settings that it's proposed reducing its emissions cap slightly further, which would actually bring that year forward to 2033 on the latest evidence. So we're going to reach this point around the mid-2030s where the emissions trading scheme is just not going to be able to provide a financial incentive for the level of emission reductions that we need. So it'll continue to deliver up to a certain level, but beyond that, we're just not going to have the price there that we need in order to make sure that those budgets are met. And so there needs to be a considered process to make sure that we can get that scheme stable and delivering what we need it to do. Either there needs to be some steps to strengthen the emissions trading scheme and make sure that it can operate effectively out in that period, or the government needs to put alongside some supporting policies that are going to deal with those emissions that it can't cover once we start getting to that period.
Hapai, kia ora, Rob. Indeed, durable solutions is always what we're seeking here. A question here from Iris Castle McLean. What constitutes a response from government? How thorough or genuine does it have to be? Can they just say no or disagree? Robin, over to you.
Question, thank you. The legislation sets out what the government's response must cover. In some cases, when the Commission provides a piece of work, such as advice on what emissions budget should be, the government, if it chooses a different path forward, needs to set out why it made that different decision. For this monitoring report, the response needs to set out a response to anything the Commission has recommended. It needs to describe the progress made in implementing the current emissions reduction plan, and it's also an opportunity to note any changes to that plan, which may or may not come in response to the monitoring report. So again, really up to the government to decide how it covers those criteria which are set out in the Act. I would also add to that the responses are published online. So I think the former Ministry for the Environment, now the Ministry of Cities, Environment, Regions and Transport, will have those on their website, so you can see how they've responded to past monitoring reports.
Thanks, Robin. Well done on remembering that acronym. I want to now pick up Hunter Douglas's question. So going back to the topic of the ETS, he asked, can you please elaborate on why the ETS is expected to be insufficient to achieve the required emissions reductions at some point in the coming decade? What types of reforms would be required to address this? I'll pass over to Rob.
Yeah, I set out some of the, thank you for the question, Hunter. I set out some of the detail of what's going on here in the previous scenario, but essentially, in order for the emissions trading scheme to deliver the level of reductions you need an even balance between the number of emission units the government is supplying into the scheme and the number that people are required to submit for the pollution that they've caused. And at the moment, the emissions trading scheme can reach that balance, and that comes from three main sources. One is from forestry, one is from industrial allocation, where the government gives free units to large emitters, who are trade exposed in order to prevent them being adversely impacted by the scheme. And then the third is through auctioning. And that auction lever is the government's main way to ensure that the emissions trading scheme remains at a stable price and has the right number of units in it. And when we get out to the 2030s, we reach a point where forestry and industrial allocation supply more units than the total amount we need. And so there's no ability for the government to auction units and to provide some control over the supply. And that means you end up with not enough emission reductions being achieved through the emissions trading scheme, and it potentially creates some volatility in the scheme where marginal forestry prices are setting that price, and that means it can jump around and be impacted by harvesting cycles and things like that. So it creates some stability issues for the scheme as well. So we need to make some changes to the scheme to help ensure that it can give a stable price and that it's delivering the level of emission reductions that we need. We have a chapter in the report called Economy and Emissions Pricing in Chapter 3, and that sets out a number of the choices that the government has to address this issue. There are a variety of different ways you can fix these issues in the scheme to make sure that it is delivering that. There's sort of trade-offs to each one, and we go through those in that chapter there.
Ina koe, Rob. I hope that was helpful to you, Hunter. I want to go now to another question from Casey McDonnell around the Commission, asking whether the Commission's looked into the trade-offs between different methods of decarbonising, e.g. decarbonising through growing rail freight versus electric trucking. I will hand over to you, Rob, to pick that one up.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the follow-up question, Casey. Yes, we absolutely consider all of the trade-offs as we're doing our work looking at the opportunities. And generally, in the transport space overall, what we see is that you're better off to do both effectively. There's a limit to how quickly you can shift things from one mode of transport to another, and there's a limit to how quickly you can recycle through the vehicle fleet by electrifying it. Um, Public transport and rail is not going to be an effective solution for every person or every business. And similarly, you look at one of the world leaders, Norway, in its electric vehicle decarbonisation, and they've achieved 99% of all new vehicle sales being electric vehicles now, but still only 35% of their fleet is electric vehicles because it takes time for those new vehicles to cycle through and replace the existing ones in the fleet. So you need a mix of both to get to your optimum level of emission reductions. In the case of rail freight, that is most efficient when you've got sort of large volume, heavy cargo that's moving a consistent route, and trucking tends to fill in your sort of first and last mile, or when you've got light things that are going unusual routes. And so the two can complement each other in a system and both play a role in enabling our freight to be decarbonised.
Fantastic. Detailed response as always, Rob. We're very lucky to have Rob at the Commission and his expertise. Hope that was helpful for you, Casey. A question now moving to from Neville. Are Climate Change Commission concerns over the ETS primarily due to low NZU price signals and no need for auction units after 2034? Or is it instead that there is a concern of afforestation rates that they've fallen and could fail to meet current NZ forecasts? Robin, I'd like to pass that question over to you.
I think, yeah, it's a good question. I think Rob has covered some of this in his previous answers. We do have concerns that there are likely to be low price signals over the coming years, and the auction supply reaches zero around 2034. That's less of a no need to auction units, but more of a outcome of the way the unit supply is set. There wouldn't be any room in the system to auction them. I am not personally across the latest afforestation forecasts, so I wouldn't comment on the second one, but this is the kind of thing we can follow up directly with you if you're interested.
Kia ora, Robin. Yes, absolutely, Never. We'll make sure to get that information to you when we follow up Thanks very much for that. A question here from Katie Glennie. So going back to the question around methane, she says, is it worth noting that the beef cattle methane bolus is still being assessed by MPI, so it is unlikely to be ready for commercial use this year? Rob, you hold a lot of the insights here around the methane technologies and answered these questions. Can you pick this one up for us, please?
Yes, it is still going through regulatory processes. When we did our report last year, we were expecting that it might be available now, but they have taken more time to make sure that those approval processes are robust and that people have confidence in the technology when it first hits the market. So they have taken a bit more time with it to make sure that they get it right. We'd still expect bolus technology to be becoming commercial and hitting the market within the next few years, but it is planned to have a sort of staggered rollout. So it's not going to go everywhere to all types of cows at once. It's going to be sort of targeted to specific groups and rolled out to a section at a time so that people can see it rolling out, have confidence in the technology, and ensure that it has a stable rollout over time.
Tēnā koe, Rob. Hope that was helpful for you, Katie. Thank you for those questions. A question now from Karan around economic ramifications of missing our climate targets through embedded international trade agreements. Robin, he's ready and waiting to answer this question.
Thanks for the question. Not as such in terms of incorporation in the modelling at this point. We do note these kinds of issues as important issues in the commentary, and we factor them into our analysis in that way. But we are at the Commission currently in the process of considering ways in which to add to the way we model emissions pathways and bring in more evidence about different economic upsides and downsides of different decisions and choices. And we hope to be able to do some of that and include it in some future reports, in the next few years. I can see that the export impacts of different emissions pathways are increasingly relevant, and so something we are looking at quite closely.
Kia ora, Robin, and tēnā koe Karan for the pātai. A question now from Kath Wallace, which responds to the question about health spending savings. She notes a recent study showed that removing gas from households improved health more than medicines did. Rob, is this something that was considered or came up during the report analysis?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Kath. It's not something we have commented on specifically in this year's report, but we are aware that there's been a few studies over time that have shown the health benefits of switching from gas in homes, and there's particular risk when you have unflued gas heating or if you have gas cooking that is not well ventilated, that can increase respiratory illnesses, particularly in children, of things like asthma. And so switching to electric cooking can provide health benefits there. And that is one of the benefits that we do see of making that transition through to electrification in homes.
Kia ora, Kath. Perhaps something that may come into play for our next emissions reduction monitoring report. Thank you for that. A question here from Kat around the role. Actually, before I ask that question, I noticed that Kat is the last question in the Q&A. We do still have a bit of time. We still have around 10 minutes. So please don't be shy. Put your questions in the chat. Use the time we have with our two puking, our two experts. No question is a silly question. So back to Kat's pātai around nature-based solutions. What role do they play beyond forestry in strengthening New Zealand's emissions pathway? Rob, is there much you can say around nature-based solutions and that came through in this report?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Kat. Chapter 6 in the report is a chapter focused on adaptation and nature, and we cover off the role of those nature-based solutions in that chapter. So there are emerging opportunities to reduce our emissions through things like restoring wetlands or what's called blue carbon, where you improve the amount of carbon that's being stored within our oceans that can help New Zealand to reduce its emissions further. We have seen the government take some further steps to try and support these in the last year, with it taking steps to support voluntary markets in these spaces and to recognise these activities more broadly with a current process available now where people can basically apply in to have one of these recognised in the emissions trading scheme. These do provide a good opportunity for New Zealand to make a further contribution to reducing its emissions. We do think that there also needs to be some caution to make sure that as we're adding these things, we make sure that they're robustly accounted for and target accounting to make sure we're aware of all the potential implications of the changes we might need to make here. And we need to be mindful if we're going to add anything further to the emissions trading scheme, whether that's going to exacerbate any of the existing issues with the scheme. And so that needs to be thought through as we make the changes to make sure that we're incentivising these. But overall, we do see further opportunities to reduce emissions through nature-based solutions, or remove emissions, I should say. There's opportunities for the government to provide further incentives there to enable that to happen.
Kia ora, Rob. And there's also within the report, at the end of the transport chapter, it also looks at the interaction between the Natural Infrastructure Plan and the National Infrastructure Plan as well. So plenty in the report there for you to look at, Kat, in regards to nature-based solutions. Thank you for that, Rob. Pātai here from Tim Street. You mentioned landfill gas, but I do not recall the context. So can you explain your attitude to landfill gas? Are you supportive of it being used to generate electricity, or would you prefer some other solution? Rob, what's your thoughts?
Thank you for the question, Tim. So the context that I raised in earlier was around government projections, and we were concerned that some of the things included in the government's projections for how much landfill gas would be expected to be reduced weren't backed up enough with government policy changes to ensure that they could be met. And so we've indicated that there should be more robust projections in that space. Overall, landfill gas capture is both an effective way to reduce emissions and generate energy for other sources. We do have concerns that there's a bit of a narrow focus at the moment. So when we're looking at waste to landfill, there are more effective ways that we could be reducing organic waste through diverting it into something like anaerobic digestion or into composting, which would reduce emissions more than just capturing the emissions with landfill gas capture. And for solutions like anaerobic digestion, you also get high value digester that can be used in our agricultural sector. So provides benefits across multiple sectors when we adopt those solutions. And if we focus only on landfill gas capture, we risk missing out on some of those other opportunities that could enable us to reduce emissions by more and can also provide greater benefits. So it's good that landfill gas capture is in place and the government's doing greater work to support it, but there's also some other opportunities there that we want to make sure that we don't miss out on.
Tēnā koe, Rob. Thank you for that. And thank you, Tim, for the question. A pātai here from Neville. The government has ruled out including agri emissions in the NZ ETS, but might agri emissions, N2O, be a sensible obligated gas for future inclusion in ETS? We're getting into the technical here. I'll hand over to Rob to pick that up.
Thank you for the question, Neville. So yes, agriculture primarily produces two different gases. One of them is biogenic methane, which is a short-lived gas, and we have a separate target for it that covers both that and biogenic methane from waste. Nitrous dioxide emissions are long-lived gases that stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and they need to be reduced just as much as carbon dioxide does or be offset. Because it's a fundamental part of how we produce food, it's unlikely we could completely eliminate nitrogen dioxide emissions. So there's something that's likely to be needed to be offset by other forms of removals in future as we move into greater levels of emission reduction. And the government has included those nitrogen dioxide emissions in the long-lived gases component of the target. So that is one of the things that is driving the current issues with the emissions trading scheme, because those emissions are counted towards that long-lived target and what we need to do to meet our emissions budgets, but they're not priced within the system. So there's a gap there that creates a mismatch between the demand that we see. One of the ways to do that is through pricing them, but there are other solutions that you could use to ensure that those emissions are offset or that people have the right incentives to reduce them.
Tēnā koe, Rob. Thank you very much. Question from Jeremy Webb. And I note that people's questions are still trickling in. So just noting the time, we probably have time for the current questions that are in there, maybe pushing it. If we don't get to your partai, we will respond to you via email after this. So don't worry if we don't get to you in the end. So the question here from Jeremy: what risk is there to trade due to climate provisions and FTAs? And is this included in models? It's been very topical on this webinar. Robin, I want to pass to you for your insights.
Thank you. The Commission, so New Zealand has trade agreements which link to our Paris Agreement obligations. Any risks or opportunities related to them is a question more for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or someone like that. What that we would see, or what we do see from the Commission's perspective, is that major export markets who New Zealand sells its goods to increasingly do want more climate action, want verifiable climate action, want to be purchasing low emissions goods and services. So whether or not trade agreements between states and countries drive action here, we do see the market driving action and customers driving action. The FTA provisions are not currently included in our climate models, but like I said before, we are actively looking at how we could add more value to the modelling that we produce, provide new types of insights alongside the work that we already provide, and we hope to be able to share more about that over the coming months and years.
Tēnā koe, Robin. There's some questions here, which looking at some positive notes, which I think is a good way to slowly bring our webinar to an end. So a question here from Daniel with a few upvotes. On a personal note, which opportunity are you most excited about as a climate solution? Thank you, Daniel. I'll pass in the first instance to Rob, and then Robin, you can share your insight too.
Thanks for the question, Daniel. I'm going to give a non-answer in that I find it too hard to choose. There's a lot of choices out there that we can adopt, and it's not a case when we come to emission reductions that you can just take one silver bullet and address the problem. We do need to be taking a broad approach across lots of areas in order to make sure that we can reduce emissions. But there are plenty of opportunities to make sure that we can get there. The two that we've really focused on in this year's report are that switch to electric vehicles and the change to industrial heat pumps, but there are plenty of opportunities out there.
Kia ora, Robin. What's your favourite climate solution that's getting you excited?
I mean, like Rob, it's hard to choose just one, right? And also for action to be effective, we can't choose just one. We need a suite of solutions across a number of different areas. But what I would say is that there've been a couple of questions that we haven't had time to answer about an area, and so I will highlight that as one which I think could be a great opportunity for the country, and that's around the way we plan and build our towns and cities through urban planning that can decrease over time transport emissions, energy emissions from buildings and things like that.
Kia ora, Robin. Thank you both for that. And our final question from Karan, which is also on a positive note. So thank you, team. Around rooftop solar, which has just passed 1 gigawatts. So this is about 9 years before even optimistic projections, which is welcome news. It is indeed. Of the solutions that the Climate Change Commission has presented that can help us meet climate targets, which are more likely to succeed due to market forces and which would require more government support? In the interest of time, I'll put to Rob. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts, but Rob, pick that one up for us, please.
Thank you, Karan. Yes, it's great to see that news on the acceleration of rooftop solar. And we also noted in this year's report that the faster adoption of solar and batteries in Australia has actually contributed to electricity prices there falling 10% in some states in the last year. So there's huge potential for technologies like that to not just reduce our emissions, but also to help reduce costs for people in the market as well. There's a lot of technologies that will come through and help us reduce our emissions. The main thing that sort of needs government more support to address, that's come through most clearly in findings this year, is addressing those upfront cost barriers. And that's not necessarily a solution that should be limited to one single technology, because you pick one thing and then you're then not incentivizing the other things that people need to be doing in a similar space. So it's the sort of thing that you wouldn't want to see just narrowly targeted support for. You'd want to see broad-based efforts by government to address the barriers people are facing, to make sure that people can choose whatever choice is most economic for them, rather than just the one that's been chosen by government.
Tēnā koe, Rob. There's still a couple more questions in the chat, but I see that they're kind of meaty ones. So Iris and Casey, Casey, your question around RMA reform and decarbonisation, and Iris, your question around the exclusion of agriculture from emissions pricing. We will email responses to you on that. Thank you so much, everyone. As always, fantastic, insightful questions. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I also want to thank our General Manager of Delivery, Robin Campbell, and our Project Director for the third Emissions Reduction Monitoring Report, Rob Carr. Tēnā kōrua.